The Jardin du Luxembourg, or the Luxembourg Garden, located in the 6th arrondissement of Paris, was created beginning in 1612 by Marie de Medici, the widow of King Henry IV of France, for a new residence she constructed, the Luxembourg Palace. The garden today is owned by the French Senate, which meets in the palace, which covers 23 hectares, is known for its lawns, tree-lined promenades, flowerbeds, the model sailboats on its circular basin, and for the picturesque Medici Fountain, built in 1620. History: in 1611, Marie de Medici, the widow of Henry IV and the regent for the King Louis XIII, decided to build a palace in imitation of the Pitti Palace in her native Florence. She purchased the Hôtel du Luxembourg and began construction of the new palace. She commissioned Salomon de Brosse to build the palace and a fountain, which still exists. In 1612 she planted 2,000 elm trees, and directed a series of gardeners, most notably Tommaso Francini, to build a park in the style she had known as a child in Florence. Francini planned 2 terraces with balustrades and parterres laid out along the axis of the chateau, aligned around a circular basin. He also built the Medici Fountain to the east of the palace as a nympheum, an artificial grotto and fountain, without its present pond and statuary. The original garden was just 8 hectares in size. In 1630 she bought additional land and enlarged the garden to 30 hectares, and entrusted the work to Jacques Boisseau de la Bouroderie, the intendant of the Royal Gardens of Tuileries and the early Garden of Versailles. He was one of the early theorists of the new and more formal Garden à la Française, and he laid out a series of squares along an east-west alley closed at the east end by the Medici Fountain, and a rectangle of parterres with broderies of flowers and hedges in front of the palace. In the center he placed an octagonal basin with a fountain, with a perspective toward what is now the Paris Observatory. Later monarchs largely neglected the garden. In 1780, the Comte de Provence, the future Louis XVIII, sold the eastern part of the garden for real estate development. Following the French Revolution, however, the leaders of the French Directory expanded the garden to 40 hectares by confiscating the land of the neighboring religious order of the Carthusian monks. The architect Jean Chalgrin, the architect of the Arc de Triomphe, took on the task of restoring the garden. He remade the Medici Fountain and laid out a long perspective from the palace to the observatory. He preserved the famous pépinière, or nursery garden of the Carthusian order, and the old vineyards, and kept the garden in a formal French style. During and after the July Monarchy of 1848, the park became the home of a large population of statues. First the queens and famous women of France, lined along the terraces. Then, in 1880s and 1890s, monuments to writers and artists, a small-scale model by Bartholdi of his Statue of Liberty and one modern sculpture by Zadkine. In 1865, during the reconstruction of Paris by Louis Napoleon, the Rue de l'Aube copyright de la Permel Park copyright E, was extended into the park, cutting off about 7 hectares, including a large part of the old nursery garden. The building of new streets next to the park also required moving and rebuilding the Medici Fountain to its present location. The long basin of the fountain was added at this time, along with the statues at the foot of the fountain. During this reconstruction, the director of Parks and Promenades of Paris, Gabriel David, built new ornamental gates and fences around the park, and polychrome brick garden houses. He also transformed what remained of the old Chartres nursery garden, at the south end of the park, into an English garden with winding paths, and planted a fruit garden in the southwest corner. He kept the regular geometric pattern of the paths and alleys, but did create one diagonal alley near the Medici Fountain which opened a view of the Pantheon. The garden in the late 19th century contained a marionette theatre, a music kiosk, greenhouses, an apiary or bee house. An orangery also used for displaying sculpture and modern art. A rose garden, the fruit orchard, and about 70 works of sculpture. Features: the garden is largely devoted to a green parterre of gravel and lawn populated with statues and centered on a large octagonal basin of water, with a central jet of water. In it children sail model boats. The garden is famed for its calm atmosphere. Surrounding the basin on the raised balustrade terraces are a series of statues of former French queens, saints and copies after the antique. In the southwest corner, there is an orchard of apple and pear trees and a Fosente des Marionnettes. The gardens include a large fenced-in playground for young children and their parents and a vintage carousel. In addition, free musical performances are presented in a gazebo on the grounds, and there is a small cafe-restaurant nearby, under the trees, with both indoor and outdoor seating from which many people enjoy the music over a glass of wine. The orangery displays art, photography and sculptures. The A per mille Col National Super copyright Rio des Mines de Paris and the Oder copyright on theatre stand next to the Luxembourg Garden. The central axis of the garden is extended, beyond its wrought iron grille and gates opening to Rue Auguste Comte, by the central esplanade of the Rue de l'Observatoire, officially the Jardin Marco Polo, where sculptures of the four times of day alternate with columns and culminate at the southern end with the 1874 fountain of the observatory, also known as the Fontaine des Quatre Parties du Monde, or the Carpeaux Fountain, for its sculptures by Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. It was installed as part of the development of the Avenue de l'Observatoire by Gabriel David in 1867. The bronze fountain represents the work of four sculptors. Louis Vuillemot carved the garlands and festoons around the pedestal, Pierre Legrain carved the armillary with interior globe and zodiac band. The animalier Emmanuel Fremier designed the 8 horses, marine turtles and spouting fish. Most importantly, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux sculpted the 4 nude women supporting the globe, representing the 4 continents of classical iconography. Open hours for the Luxembourg Garden depend on the month, opening between 7:30 and 8:15 a.m. Closing at dusk between 4:45 and 9:45 p.m. Statuary. The garden contains just over 100 statues, monuments, and fountains, scattered throughout the grounds. Surrounding the central green space are 20 figures of French queens and illustrious women standing on pedestals. They were commissioned by Louis Philippe in 1848 and include, Saint Berthild, Bertha of Burgundy, Matilda, Duchess of Normandy, St. Genevieve, Mary I of Scotland, Jeanne III of Navarre, Clack copyright Mencesor, Anne-Marie Louise of Orleans copyright Anne's, Louise of Savoy, Margaret of Anjou, Lara de Noves, Marie de Medici, Marguerite of Navarre, Valentina Visconti, Anne of France, Blanche of Castile, Anne of Austria, Anne of Brittany, Margaret of Provence, Saint Clotilde. Other sculptured work includes Pierre-Guillaume Fra copyright Dower copyright Ric Leplay, by Andrew copyright Joseph Aller, 1906, Statue of Liberty, first model, by Fra copyright Dower copyright Ric Bartholdi, 1870, La Bocca della Verita, by Jules Blanchard, Ludwig van Beethoven, by Antoine Bourdelle, placed here 1978, Monument to Henri Merger, by Thar copyrightophile Henri Bouwelen, 1895, multiple animal sculptures by Auguste Caine, Le Triomphe de Silonie, 1885, Homage to Delacroix, 1890, and Monument to Auguste Schirra-Kestner, 1908, both by Jules Daller, Monument to Jean-Antoine Watteau, by Henri Dar copyright Sierra copyright Gorquia copyright, 1896, Narcissus, 1869, and Orion Asses sur un Dauphin, 1870, both by Ernest Huguenin Heil, Hippomons by Jean-Antoine Jalbert, Bust of Charles Baudelaire, by Pierre Farr copyright Lix Massot, Polyphemus Surprising Asses in Galatia, The Fontaine Mar copyright Isis, by Auguste Otten, 1866, Clack copyright Mencesor by Antoine-Augustin Prat copyright Alt, Theseus and the Minotaur, by Etienne Jules Remy, 1826, Hercules diverting the river Alpheus, 1900, and Leffert, 1902, both by Pierre Roche, Paul Verlaine, by Rodot. 1911, Monument to a per-mille de Lodge Branly, by Charles Marie Louis Joseph Sarabe Soles, Georges Sand, by Frena Section La copyright on Sicard, 1904, Jules Massenet, by Raoul Vellet, 1926, Marshal Ney, by Frena Section Rud and Alphonse de Guizes, 1853. Medici Fountain. The Medici Fountain was built in 1630 by Marie de Medici, the widow of King Henry IV of France and regent of King Louis XIII of France. It was designed by Tommaso Francini, a Florentine fountain maker and hydraulic engineer who was brought from Florence to France by King Henry IV. It was in the form of a grotto, a popular feature of the Italian Renaissance garden. It fell into ruins during the 18th century, but in 1811, at the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, the fountain was restored by Jean Chalgrin, the architect of the Arc de Triomphe. Indiana, 1864-66, the fountain was moved to its present location, centered on the east front of the Palais du Luxembourg. The long basin of water was built and flanked by plane trees, and the sculptures of the giant Polyphemus surprising the lovers Assis and Galatea, by French classical sculptor Auguste Autin, were added to the grotto's rockwork. Hidden behind the Medici Fountain is the Fontaine de la Copyright d'Art, a wall fountain built during the time of Napoleon Bonaparte at the corner of the Rue du Regard and Rue de Vaugirard, with a bas-relief sculpture depicting the legend of Leda and the swan by Achille Vaulois. When the original site was destroyed during the prolongation of the Rue de Rennes in 1856 by Louis Napoleon, the fountain was preserved and moved in 1866 to the Luxembourg Gardens and attached to the back of the Medici Fountain. Jardin du Luxembourg. In popular culture, the gardens are featured prominently in Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. It is here that the principal love story of the novel unfolds, as the characters Marius Pontmercy and Cosette first meet. Henry James also uses the gardens, in The Ambassadors, as the place where his character Lambert Stuther has an epiphany about his identity. The final scene of William Faulkner's novel Sanctuary is set in the gardens. Patrick Modiano heard the news he had won the 2014 Nobel Prize in Literature via a mobile phone call from his daughter while walking through Paris, just next to the Jardin du Luxembourg. Non-literary references include as the setting for a few episodes of French in Action, the cover of Tame Impala's 2012 album L'Honneurisme, the title of a song by the band The Ghost of a Saber-Toothed Tiger, and the Gardens and Palace being added as a mission in the video game Assassin's Creed Unity. Images. See also: List of parks and gardens in Paris. References. Bibliography, Andrew copyright Arnold Peltier and Vasily Karist, Le Jardin du Luxembourg / The Luxembourg Gardens, a Permilditions Pippa, collection Itinéraire copyright Rances, Paris Aces Fontaines, de la Renaissance in Jours, texts assembled by Dominique Massouni, Pauline Prévost, Marcel Hussey and Daniel Rabro, de copyright Légation à l'Action Artistique de la Ville de Paris. From the collection Paris et son patrimoine, directed by Béatrice d'Andia. Paris, 1995. Dominique Jarras. Copyright, Grammaire des Jardins Parisiens, Paragram, Paris, 2007. External links: the Luxembourg Gardens page at the Project for Public Spaces, the Jardin du Luxembourg, current and old photographs of the garden, statues, fountains, detailed map with sculptures, info, and Jardin du Luxembourg walk, the Luxembourg Gardens at Twilight, one of a series of paintings featuring the gardens by American artist John Singer Sargent, web pages about the garden.